In late October 1944, the seas of the Philippines erupted in fire. Japan's fleets converged on Leyte, determined to fight one last battle to protect their lifeline. From Sibuyan to Surigao, from Samar to Cape Engao, 4 thrusts merged into a storm of steel. Amid the inferno, small escort ships and hastily launched pilots turned the tide. Every decision, made in an instant, shaped the final outcome. Now, let us return to each day and each hour of the largest naval battle in history, where the fate of Japan's fleet was sealed. In the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive turning point. After years of grueling island-hopping campaigns, the U.S. and Allied forces finally closed in on the once impenetrable defensive perimeter of Japan. At the heart of this defense lay the Philippines, a chain of islands whose importance could not be overstated. In 1942, the archipelago had fallen to Japan after the bitter defeat at Bataan and the infamous Death March, leaving a deep scar on American pride. Yet beyond symbolism, the Philippines was Japan's lifeline. Through it flowed oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber and tin from Malaya and Burma. If the Allies severed this artery, Japan would be cut off from its vital resources, its fleet starved of fuel, its armies slowly strangled. General Douglas MacArthur had long understood this reality. For him, the Philippines was not only a military objective, but also a personal debt of honor. In 1942, as Japanese forces overwhelmed Luzon, he had been forced to retreat to Australia. From the deck of a small boat, MacArthur gave his legendary vow, "I shall return." Now, 2 years later, the moment had come to fulfill it. On October 20th, 1944, under heavy bombardment, tens of thousands of American troops stormed the beaches of Leyte. Tanks and artillery rolled ashore behind wave after wave of infantry. Wading through the surf, MacArthur himself set foot on the sand and proclaimed the liberation of the Philippines had begun. For Tokyo's high command, the landing was an earthquake. If Leyte fell, Japan's entire Southeast Asian defense network would collapse. In desperation, they prepared to stake everything on one last gamble, committing nearly all that remained of the Imperial Navy to a massive counterstroke. The plan called for a 3-pronged assault. The Central Force, the strongest, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would push through the San Bernardino Strait into Leyte Gulf. To the south, Vice Admirals Shoji Nishimura and Kiyohide Shima would lead 2 converging squadrons through the Surigao Strait. Meanwhile, to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carriers would serve as sacrificial bait, luring the U.S. fleet away from Leyte. The Americans were equally prepared. Admiral William F. Halsey's 3rd Fleet, built around fast carrier task forces, stood ready to deliver the decisive blow. At the same time, Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet focused on shielding the invasion force directly. The imbalance of strength was overwhelming. The Japanese entered the battle with fewer aircraft than the total number of American warships deployed across Philippine waters. By late October 1944, around the islands of Leyte and Samar, the die was cast. The largest naval battle in human history was about to erupt, a clash spanning hundreds of miles of ocean where the fate of 2 empires would be sealed in fire, steel, and blood. On the night of October 22nd and into the early hours of October 23rd, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the giant battleships Yamato and Musashi, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers, quietly moved through the Palawan Passage. But their secrecy did not last. At 0016, the American submarine USS Darter detected the Japanese formation on radar and began shadowing it. At 0524, Darter fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, at least 4 of which struck Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Otago. The ship sank within minutes, forcing Kurita to abandon ship before being rescued by a destroyer and transferring his flag to the battleship Yamato. Moments later, Darter hit another 2 torpedoes into the cruiser Takao, crippling it so badly that it had to retreat to Singapore and was removed from the battle. Meanwhile, the submarine USS Dace launched its own attack, sinking the cruiser Maya. In just a few short hours, Japan's Spearhead lost 2 modern cruisers and exposed its movements. The report sent back from Darter gave the Americans crucial insight into enemy intentions, prompting the U.S. Third Fleet to place all carrier groups on full alert. On the morning of October 24th, as Kurita's fleet advanced into the Sibuyan Sea, it entered the range of American carrier aircraft. Beginning around 8 a.m., waves of F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes roared in from the carriers of the Third Fleet. Though Halsey's full carrier force was not present, some task groups were detached for resupply. 3 carrier groups still struck with overwhelming force. The first wave alone scored bomb hits on the battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi, while also disabling the cruiser Myoko. Subsequent attacks concentrated on Musashi, the pride of the Japanese Navy. Dozens of bombs and torpedoes slammed into the giant ship, flooding compartments and forcing it to fall behind the formation. By late afternoon, under relentless air assault, Kurita temporarily ordered his fleet to turn back, giving the Americans the false impression that the center force was retreating. But at 7:30 p.m., after enduring nearly 20 bomb and 20 torpedo hits, Musashi finally capsized and sank beneath the Sibuyan Sea, taking over 1,000 crew with her. Despite the loss of Musashi and damage to several other ships, most of Kurita's heavy units remained combat-ready. He had merely pulled back to await a better opportunity to strike. While Halsey's carriers pounded Kurita's fleet, the Japanese launched their own counterattack from the skies. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi sent about 200 planes from Luzon to strike at the American carrier groups. Most were intercepted and destroyed by Hellcats, with ace pilot David McCampbell famously shooting down 9 aircraft in a single sortie. Still, one Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber broke through and at 9:38 a.m. dropped a 250-kilogram bomb onto the light carrier USS Princeton. The bomb punched through the flight deck, igniting fires in the hangar. At 3:23 p.m., massive secondary explosions, likely from stored ordnance, ripped the carrier apart, sending a huge column of smoke and flame skyward. The cruiser USS Birmingham, which had come alongside to assist, suffered heavy damage and over 300 casualties from the blast. Finally, at 5:50 p.m., with no hope of saving her, the destroyer USS Reno fired torpedoes to scuttle Princeton. It was the first U.S. carrier lost in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By nightfall on October 24th, the clash over the Sibuyan Sea had come to a close. Kurita's fleet had temporarily withdrawn to the west, while Halsey shifted his focus northward, where Japan's decoy carrier force had just revealed itself, setting the stage for the next dramatic phase of the largest naval battle in history. On the night of October 24th, and into the early morning of October 25th, 1944, the southern wing of the Japanese fleet steamed into Surigao Strait, directly into an ambush that the Americans had meticulously prepared. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. They had endured some air attacks on October 24th, but suffered only light damage. However, Strict radio silence meant Nishimura could not coordinate with Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's force, which was 40 kilometers behind, nor with Kurita's main body far to the north. As a result, in the early hours of October 25th, Nishimura's force advanced alone into the strait, unaware that a layered trap awaited them. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the American defenses in Surigao Strait under the 7th Fleet, had arranged a textbook ambush. At the entrance, 39 PT boats patrolled to harass and report enemy movements. Behind them, destroyer squadrons waited on both flanks of the narrow channel. And blocking the far end of the strait stood Oldendorf's battle line. 6 battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. Most had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor, but were now resurrected, rebuilt with modern radar fire control systems. Oldendorf planned to execute the classic crossing the T maneuver, pouring concentrated fire across the Japanese line of advance. At 22:36 on October 24th, American PT boats made first contact, darting in and launching torpedoes. For over 3 hours, they harassed Nishimura's ships. None of their torpedoes hit, but they forced the Japanese to maneuver and sent back continuous reports to Oldendorf. By 3 a.m. on October 25th, the Japanese column had entered deep into the strait. Then American destroyers surged from both flanks, unleashing spreads of torpedoes. Disaster struck. Both Fuso and Yamashiro were hit. Fuso exploded violently, breaking in two, with part of the burning wreckage left floating. Yamashiro also took hits, but, with frantic damage control, managed to press forward. 2 of Nishimura's destroyers were sunk outright, and another, Asagumo, was crippled and forced to withdraw, later sinking from damage. At 3:53, the battleship USS West Virginia locked onto targets with her radar at 21 kilometers and fired the opening salvo. Her 16-inch shells screamed through the darkness and struck Yamashiro within seconds. Instantly, the rest of Oldendorf's line joined in. California and Tennessee loosed 14-inch broadsides, while Maryland added 48 more 16-inch shells. The night sky over Surigao blazed with arcs of red fire. The Japanese, lacking radar fire control, were blind. They could barely see their enemies, let alone return accurate fire. Within minutes, Nishimura's force was annihilated under a storm of shells. Yamashiro absorbed dozens of heavy hits before capsizing and sinking around 4:20, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura and nearly all his crew down with her. The cruiser Mogami and destroyer Shigur turned and fled south. Mogami limped away badly damaged, while Shigur was the lone survivor of Nishimura's squadron, the only witness to the total destruction of Japan's southern force in the inferno of Surigao Strait. Not long after Nishimura's force had been annihilated, Japan's second southern contingent under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima arrived at the mouth of Surigao Strait, about 40 kilometers behind. His force included the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara and 8 destroyers. Seeing the burning wreckage ahead, in fact the 2 halves of the shattered battleship Fuso, Shima was stunned. Realizing the fate of the advance force, he immediately ordered a retreat, thus ending any hope of a Japanese breakthrough from the south. In the confusion of turning back, Shima's flagship Nachi collided with the damaged cruiser Mogami, crippling the latter and forcing it to fall behind. The next morning, American aircraft finished off Mogami offshore, while Nachi and the other ships that escaped would themselves be destroyed in subsequent air raids not long afterward. The Battle of Surigao Strait thus ended by dawn on October 25th with a decisive Allied victory. It marked the last battleship-to-battleship engagement in naval history, and the final successful execution of the legendary Crossing the T maneuver. Japan's southern force was virtually wiped out. Of Nishimura's 7 ships, only the destroyer Shigure escaped, while Nishimura himself went down with his flagship. Shima's force accomplished nothing, retreating in failure. Yet while the southern thrust had been crushed, events to the north of Leyte Gulf suddenly turned dangerous for the Allies. Admiral William Halsey, lured by the threat of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy carrier force, had led all 3 of his fast carrier task groups northward on the night of October 24th to chase Ozawa. He even took with him Task Force 34, Vice Admiral Willis Lee's powerful battleship group, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. At 7th Fleet headquarters, commanders assumed Halsey had left heavy ships to cover the strait, but in truth, the northern gateway to Leyte Gulf lay wide open. And that was precisely the opportunity Kurita had been waiting for. At around 3 o'clock on October 25th, Kurita led his center force, 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 cruisers, and numerous destroyers, through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Sweeping around the eastern side of Samar Island, the Japanese fleet turned south, intending to strike the Allied landing forces at Leyte from the north. The only units in their path were the small escort carrier groups of the U.S. 7th Fleet, known by the codename Taffy. There were 3 such groups, Taffy 1, 2, and 3. Each contained 4 to 6 escort carriers, for a total of 16 carriers operating about 450 planes, supported by a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. These baby carriers were slow, thinly armored, and carried mostly anti-submarine planes and light ground attack aircraft, not designed for fleet combat. Their escorts were lightly armed, barely suited to stand against battleships and heavy cruisers. By contrast, Kurita's center force, though damaged in earlier battles, remained one of the most powerful fleets afloat, second only to the U.S. carrier arm. The battleship Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons, roughly equal to the combined weight of all 16 ships of Taffy 3. A hopelessly uneven confrontation loomed, a clash between a predator and its helpless prey, a tiger against lambs. What neither side yet realized was how extraordinary the coming fight would become. On the morning of October 25th, 1944, as the Japanese fleet crept toward the coast of Samar, a lookout aboard the super battleship Yamato suddenly spotted the silhouettes of American carrier masts on the horizon. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita instantly believed he had stumbled upon Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet carriers. Exultant, he signaled headquarters. "Heaven has given us the chance to strike the American fleet. Attack the carriers first, then destroy the rest." In reality, what lay ahead was not Halsey's main force, but Task Unit Taffy 3 under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Only 6 small escort carriers, each carrying about 28 planes, protected by 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. This modest unit was providing direct air support for the Leyte landings. At about 6:45, aboard the flagship Fanshawe Bay, American sailors suddenly saw towering columns of black smoke and the looming shapes of massive Japanese warships to the northwest. Alarm klaxons shrieked across the formation. Though shocked, Sprague reacted instantly. He ordered all carriers to turn south at maximum speed while launching every aircraft immediately, even without full armament loads. A sudden squall nearby offered precious cover. The American ships ducked into the rain curtain while their destroyers laid thick smoke screens to shield the vulnerable carriers. The deadly chase at Samar had begun. Kurita, unaware that Ozawa's northern decoy force had already succeeded in drawing Halsey away, still thought he was facing the American main fleet. Initially ordering his ships into anti-air formations, he abruptly changed his mind. At 6:58 from Yamato's bridge, he gave the command, "General attack!" The Japanese line surged forward, abandoning cohesion, thundering toward Sprague's tiny force. The Yamato's 18.1-inch guns roared, hurling 1.6-ton shells that whistled through the sky and crashed into the sea around the escort carriers. The concussion was so immense that American ships tens of kilometers away shuddered. Sailors later said the shells sounded like freight trains rushing overhead. In that desperate moment, the Americans displayed astonishing valor. The destroyer USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest E. Evans, was closest to the enemy. Without waiting for orders, Evans broke formation, poured on speed, and charged directly into the Japanese fleet, smoke billowing from her stacks. Johnston fired a spread of torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her to fall back. But Johnston was soon struck by Yamato's massive guns, badly crippling her. Inspired by this act, Sprague issued his now famous command: "Small boys, attack!" At once, 3 more ships, the destroyers Hole and Heermann and the escort destroyer Samuel B. Roberts, turned to engage an enemy force many times their size. Hole launched torpedoes at the cruiser Haguro and fought furiously until silenced by fatal hits to her engine room. Heermann pressed attacks against Haguro and even harassed the battleship Congo, loosing torpedoes and guns in a desperate gamble. The tiny Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, charged the cruiser Chokai, firing every 5-inch shell aboard and launching all her torpedoes. These reckless charges, aided by dense smoke screens, threw the Japanese into confusion. Their captains swerved frantically to evade torpedoes, slowing the pursuit. Yet the cost to Taffy 3 was devastating. Hole was pounded until she drifted helpless and went down under Congo's fire. Johnston, after hours of defiance, was smashed by dozens of heavy hits and sank with Evans, who would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. Samuel B. Roberts fought until out of ammunition, shattered by enemy salvos, and abandoned by her crew. Though outgunned and doomed, these small American ships had bought precious time. Their ferocious stand distracted and delayed Kurita's armada, giving the fragile escort carriers a chance to survive, and forcing one of the most powerful fleets in the world to falter in the waters off Samar. In the air, Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid of the 7th Fleet and Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, commander of the escort carrier groups, called for every aircraft from Taffy 1, 2, and 3, nearly 450 planes in total, to launch continuous strikes against the Japanese fleet. Armed with bombs, torpedoes, or only machine guns, wave after wave of American planes dove on the enemy. FM-2 Wildcats strafed at low altitude, while TBM Avengers dropped whatever ordnance they had, bombs, rockets, torpedoes, even depth charges or fuel tanks, onto Japanese decks. Lacking the support of Halsey's fast carrier air groups, these escort carrier pilots became the lifeline of their comrades, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire with reckless courage. Some attacks from Taffy 2 under Rear Admiral Felix Stump inflicted serious damage on the Japanese formation. All morning long, the skies over Samar blazed with engine roar, tracers, and explosions. The battle on the morning of October 25th was ferocious beyond measure. Despite the Americans' valiant resistance, many small ships took punishing hits. The escort carriers themselves were not spared. The Gambier Bay, trailing at the end of Taffy 3's line, came under concentrated fire from the heavy cruisers Chikuma and Chokai. Shells ripped through her thin decks, slowing her down and setting her ablaze. At 8:45, she rolled over and sank, the only American aircraft carrier in World War II ever sunk by naval gunfire. Other escort carriers, including Kalinin Bay, Kitkoon Bay, and White Plains, were also hit and damaged, but managed to lay smoke and continue fleeing. This desperate resistance achieved something vital. It convinced the Japanese that they were up against a powerful U.S. carrier force, perhaps even Halsey's main fleet, rather than mere escort carriers. Kurita's order for a general attack had already thrown his force into disarray. Ships lost contact and scattered in the chaos of pursuit, breaking their cohesion. Even Yamato was forced to maneuver hard to avoid incoming torpedoes, unintentionally pulling her out of action during the critical phase of battle. By about 9:20, Kurita abruptly ordered the pursuit halted and turned his fleet north to regroup. Japanese ships ceased fire, laid smoke, and withdrew under continued American air attacks. On the shattered, burning U.S. escort carriers, surviving sailors watched in disbelief as the enemy suddenly disengaged. Taffy 3 had held long enough to force the Japanese to abandon the fight. Yet Kurita was not finished. After regrouping at a safer distance around 11 a.m., he again turned south, seemingly determined to break into Leyte Gulf and smash the Allied invasion fleet. At that moment, however, a message reached him, later proven false intelligence, reporting a powerful U.S. carrier force moving down from the north. Believing this to be Halsey returning, and drawn by the chance to battle America's main fleet rather than transport ships, Kurita once more reversed course. That fateful decision inadvertently saved the entire Allied invasion force at Leyte. General Douglas MacArthur later admitted that, at that moment, dozens of fully loaded transport ships sat vulnerable in the Gulf. Had the Japanese broken through and destroyed them, over 100,000 U.S. troops ashore would have been left in dire jeopardy. But the opportunity slipped away. Chasing a phantom fleet to the north, Kurita eventually abandoned the effort. By late afternoon on October 25th, he ordered a full retreat, leading his battered force back through the San Bernardino Strait. Meanwhile, as the battle off Samar raged in the south, to the north off Cape Engao, Admiral Halsey struck the decisive blow against Ozawa's decoy force. Ozawa's northern force was in truth pitifully weak. Only 4 carriers remained, among them Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from Pearl Harbor, and the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. They were escorted by 2 old battleships, Issei and Hyuga, partially converted into hybrid carriers but without air groups, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Worse still, after catastrophic losses of trained aviators in previous battles, the 4 carriers together had fewer than 110 operational aircraft, nowhere near enough to threaten Halsey's mighty Third Fleet. Though Halsey had initially taken the bait and left Leyte unguarded, he also saw a golden opportunity to wipe out Japan's carrier arm once and for all. On the night of October 24th to 25th, he ordered 9 carriers, including the fleet carriers Enterprise, Essex, Intrepid, Franklin, Lexington, and 4 light carriers, along with 6 of America's most modern battleships, to race north toward Ozawa. At dawn on October 25th, Ozawa launched about 75 aircraft in a desperate strike against the Third Fleet. But, as with Onishi's raids from Luzon, nearly all were shot down by American Hellcats long before reaching their targets. Only a few limped back to base. Halsey responded with overwhelming force. Even before sunrise, 180 American planes had already been launched to locate and strike the enemy. At 7:10, U.S. scouts found Ozawa's fleet, and American squadrons immediately pounced. From 8 a.m. that morning until late afternoon, U.S. carriers flew 527 sorties, hammering the Japanese. The results were decisive. Nearly the entire remaining Japanese carrier force was annihilated. The flagship Zuikaku was struck and set ablaze. Her crew performed a final flag-lowering ceremony before she slipped beneath the waves at midday. The light carriers Chitose and Zuiho were also hit, exploding and sinking. Chiyoda was crippled and left adrift, only to be finished off the next day by cruisers and destroyers. The destroyer Akazuki, part of Ozawa's escort, was blown apart by bombs. What little remained of the northern force was powerless. Admiral Ozawa had to transfer his flag to the cruiser Oyodo to direct the retreat. Thus, Japan's last carrier decoy gambit backfired completely. In just a single morning, the Imperial Navy's final carrier striking force was virtually wiped out, while Halsey's fleet suffered only minimal losses. Although victorious in the north, Halsey soon faced grim news from the south. Beginning at 9 a.m. on October 25th, urgent messages poured in from Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, reporting that the escort forces off Samar were in desperate danger and pleading for the 3rd Fleet to come to their aid. It was not until around 10 o'clock that Halsey fully grasped the situation. Kurita's center force had not been destroyed, but had instead broken through and was directly threatening the Leyte landing area. Halsey immediately ordered his battleship task group to turn south at full speed to reinforce, leaving his carrier groups to finish off Ozawa's remnants in the north. But time was not on the American side. By early afternoon on October 25th, as Halsey was still racing south, Kurita had already withdrawn from Samar. That evening, unable to vent his frustration directly on his elusive opponent, Halsey ordered his aircraft and warships to strike any Japanese vessel still within reach. In the night of October 25th to 26th, a U.S. cruiser-destroyer group intercepted the destroyer Nowaki, the last straggler of Kurita's force, and quickly sank her off the San Bernardino Strait. By October 26th, all surviving Japanese ships had retreated from the area, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf officially came to an end. The American beachhead at Leyte had been secured, cementing a decisive turning point in the campaign to liberate the Philippines. That same morning, October 25th, another shocking event unfolded. After the surface battles subsided, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi launched the first organized suicide air attacks, the beginning of Japan's infamous Kamikaze strategy, which would haunt the final phase of the war. Wave after wave of kamikaze planes hurled themselves at Allied ships, ignoring the curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Off Samar, one aircraft broke through the defenses and slammed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The impact triggered a chain of massive explosions, ripping the ship apart and sending her to the bottom along with nearly 150 sailors. St. Lo became the first warship in history to be sunk by a coordinated suicide attack. The strike stunned the Americans and revealed a bitter truth. Japan had reached the end of its rope, forced to stake its hopes on desperate acts of self-destruction. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with a decisive victory for the Allies. For Japan, its grand counteroffensive plan to turn the tide had collapsed completely. The Imperial Navy suffered catastrophic losses: 1 fleet carrier, Zuikaku, 3 light carriers, Chitos, Chiyoda, Zuiho, 3 battleships, Musashi, Yamashiro, Fuso, at least 8 cruisers, and 12 destroyers were sunk. More than 10,000 Japanese officers and sailors perished in just a few days of brutal combat. The Americans, too, paid a heavy price, though one acceptable in light of their strategic success. 1 light carrier, Princeton, 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay, St. Lo, 2 destroyers, Howell, Johnston, 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts. About 200 aircraft shot down, and some 3,000 men killed. Yet the Allied landing force at Leyte had been safeguarded, and with it, the foothold for the liberation of the entire Philippines was secured. Leyte entered history not only as the largest naval battle ever fought, but also as a turning point of immense consequence in the Pacific War. The bone of the Imperial Japanese Navy was shattered beyond recovery. The surviving capital ships, crippled by fuel shortages and stripped of air cover, remained idle in their bases until the war's end. The U.S. Navy and its allies, meanwhile, pressed their overwhelming advantage, seizing firm control of the Pacific and opening the way to strike directly at Japan's home islands, virtually unopposed at sea. Thus, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is remembered as an epic requiem, the last thunder of the great battleships, and a testament to the courage and sacrifice of the men who achieved the impossible amid the fire and chaos of war.